It was a killer that walked in plain sight, a murderer made of air itself. In December 1952, London was attacked not by a foreign army, but by its own breath. For 5 days, the city vanished, swallowed by a darkness so thick it blinded buses and suffocated the young in their beds. This is the story of the week the air turned to poison, and the thousands who had to die for the world to learn a simple, terrible truth. December 5, 1952. The day began like any other winter morning in London, cold, damp, and dim. The kind of day that made chimney smoke rise in lazy curls above the rooftops. Housewives lit their stoves, factories roared back to life, and the great city went about its business beneath a dull gray sky. But that morning, something unseen was already descending, a heavy stillness in the air, a breath that felt thicker, slower. The Thames lay unmoving, and the wind that usually swept through the city had vanished. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt, waiting. By noon, a brownish haze began to settle over the streets. Londoners didn't panic. After all, fog was an old companion. They called it pea soup, thick, yellow-green fog that blurred lamplight into glowing orbs. But this fog was different. It smelled wrong. Acrid. Bitter. It burned the throat and left a metallic taste on the tongue. By the time Big Ben struck 3, even the policemen guiding traffic were wrapping scarves over their mouths. By sunset, London disappeared. Entire neighborhoods vanished into darkness. Bus drivers could no longer see the curb. Pedestrians stumbled through blackness so dense they could barely see their own feet. Street lamps, one by one, were swallowed whole. And yet, this wasn't nightfall, it was something else entirely. People lit candles and went to bed early, assuming the fog would lift by morning. But morning came, and the city still hadn't returned. In the upper floors of hospitals, nurses watched the haze creeping in through broken window seals, slow, like smoke from an unseen fire. It moved down corridors, filled lungs, clung to bedsheets. The elderly began coughing violently. Children complained of chest pain. And in the cold heavy districts, the poor parts of London where people burned whatever they could to stay warm, the coughing never stopped. By midday, the smog was so thick that Londoners could no longer rely on sight. People walked with arms outstretched, touching walls to find their way. Trains slowed to a crawl. Ambulances gave up responding to calls because the drivers couldn't see more than a yard ahead. Inside homes, candles burned orange halos in the gloom, but outside, even headlights were useless. One witness recalled standing outside Westminster Bridge and hearing the roar of the river, but seeing nothing. It was as if the world had been erased, he said. You could hear life, but not see it. The air grew colder as the day faded. Londoners huddled indoors, sealing windows, burning more coal for warmth, not realizing they were feeding the very thing that was killing them. The fog had trapped their smoke, and the smoke had turned the fog into poison. Sulfur, soot, tar, all swirling together in a deadly soup no one could escape. In the wealthier boroughs, the smog dulled chandeliers and turned silver black. But in East London, it killed. Children wheezed through the night. Old men fell asleep and never woke. The fog crept into hospitals, too, choking even those under oxygen masks. There were reports of patients who suffocated despite every attempt to save them, not from lack of air, but from the air itself. And still, no one could explain it. The newspapers called it the Great Fog. Radio announcers advised people to stay home, but the city couldn't stop. Trains had to run, factories had to burn coal, and people had to eat. Each breath of survival only thickened the blanket of death. That evening, a young nurse at St. Bartholomew's Hospital stepped outside for air. She took one breath and began to cough uncontrollably. Her eyes burned. The air smelled of burnt rubber and decay. She turned back toward the hospital, but the door, just 10 feet away, was gone. Lost in the fog. For 5 long minutes, she stumbled, hands out, calling into the darkness. Her voice vanished in the thick silence. When she finally found the door handle, her fingers were black with soot. Later, she would say she felt as though she had walked through death. Stories like this are forgotten until we choose to remember them. If you want to join us in uncovering the lost chapters of history, consider subscribing to our channel. We have so many more stories to tell. Inside Parliament, whispers began. Something about a weather inversion, about the cold trapping pollution close to the ground. But no one wanted to call it what it was, a man-made disaster. A city choking on its own breath. By the end of the first night, morgues were already filling. But London had no idea how much worse it would get. The fog was only beginning to kill. By dawn of the second day, the city's pulse had slowed. The usual rumble of buses, the clatter of hooves, the distant wail of sirens, all were muffled, drowned beneath a heavy shroud that refused to lift. The smog had settled like a curse. Londoners woke to find their curtains stained brown, their lungs burning, their voices hoarse. The sky was gone. It wasn't gray anymore, it was black. Doctors across the city began to see the same pattern. Elderly patients came in coughing, wheezing, gasping. Infants turned blue in their mothers' arms. The hospitals filled so quickly that beds were placed in hallways, and even those hallways began to vanish in the haze. "It's the worst winter I've seen," said one physician. "But this isn't flu. It's the air itself." At Westminster, government officials gathered in tense silence. The Ministry of Health issued cautious statements. "A dense fog," they called it, "an unfortunate spell of weather." But behind closed doors, one advisor to the Prime Minister whispered the truth no one dared to print: "We've poisoned ourselves." The realization was as terrifying as it was unbelievable. London had always run on coal, black gold, the heart of its industry and warmth. Millions of chimneys belched smoke daily, a badge of progress since the Victorian age. But after the war, the city had been burning a cheaper grade of coal, soft, sulfur-rich, unrefined. It was foul-smelling, oily, and full of tar. And when the cold arrived, people burned more than ever. Combine that with a strange weather inversion, a layer of warm air above the city that trapped the cold air below, and London had become its own gas chamber. The smoke couldn't escape. The city was breathing in every chimney, every factory, every engine's exhale. Out in the streets, horses collapsed mid-step. The ambulance drivers tried to guide vehicles by walking in front with lantern, but the light only bounced back at them. One driver said it felt like trying to shine a torch through mud. In the East End, people groped along walls to find their doors. Trains halted. Buses stopped mid-route. And when one double-decker bus attempted to move near Aldgate, it struck a pedestrian. The driver hadn't seen the man until his face hit the windshield. By midday, the hospitals were running out of oxygen tanks. Nurses wrapped damp towels around patients' faces to help them breathe, but the towels quickly turned black. Those with asthma or bronchitis were the first to fall. Soon, even the healthy began to struggle. "It feels like drowning on dry land," said a soldier home from Korea. "You breathe, but the air won't come." The smog crept into theaters and pubs, turning laughter into coughing fits. Inside one cinema on Shaftesbury Avenue, a reel kept spinning while the audience quietly filed out. They couldn't see the screen anymore. Outside, funeral processions lost their way, and mourners found themselves stranded beside unmarked corners, unable to see the hearse they followed. On the night of December 6th, a meeting was called inside the Ministry of Health. Scientists, meteorologists, and doctors gathered to discuss the crisis. Cigarette smoke hung in the air, ironically adding to the haze in the room. A public health expert named Dr. Horace R. Green stood up, his voice trembling. "This is not fog. This is smog. A mixture of smoke and sulfur dioxide, a lethal combination. If it continues, we will see thousands dead before it lifts." His warning was met with silence. No one wanted to imagine a number that high. Britain had survived the Blitz, rationing, and plague, but this? Invisible, slow, inescapable. It felt unthinkable. Yet outside, the death toll was quietly climbing. At St. Thomas' Hospital, nurses reported that newborns were struggling to breathe within hours of birth. Doctors covered the windows, but the smog seeped through cracks. Inside one ward, a power failure left incubators cold. 2 babies died before dawn. In Whitechapel, an undertaker noted he was burying twice as many bodies as usual. "It's not a fog," he told his apprentice. "It's the air turning against us." On the third day, the panic began. People rushed to chemists, begging for masks or medicine, but none could help. Cloths soaked in vinegar were sold as remedies. They weren't. Housewives stuffed wet rags under doors. Street markets vanished entirely, stalls stood deserted under an invisible blanket of death. And through it all, London's leaders hesitated. Admitting the smog was man-made would mean admitting fault, years of industrial neglect, outdated laws, and blind faith in coal. So, the city stayed open. Work continued. And the fog thickened. From Westminster Bridge, a photographer tried to capture the moment, the Houses of Parliament lost in shadow, the Thames a mirror of darkness. But the picture came out blank. The camera saw nothing. That night, a boy in Poplar asked his mother, "When will the sun come back?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because she, too, had started coughing. The next morning, undertakers began running out of coffins. London was suffocating. And the fog, the killer no one wanted to name, was only halfway done. By December 9th, the smog began to thin, but not disappear. It drifted like a ghost now, torn into ragged patches by a faint wind. For the first time in nearly 5 days, the shapes of rooftops began to emerge. Londoners cracked open their windows, hoping for relief. But what came in wasn't clean air. It was the smell of death. Hospitals were overflowing. Morgues could no longer hold the bodies. In some districts, icehouses were commandeered to store the dead. The first estimate spoke of hundreds, then thousands. But no one truly knew. Many had died quietly in their beds, their passing unnoticed until neighbors smelled something wrong. The city coroner's office worked round the clock, its workers coughing between signatures. Newspapers tiptoed around the truth. Fog deaths linked to cold, read one headline. Respiratory illness on the rise. But in the wards, doctors had no doubt. The victims' lungs were blackened, inflamed, heavy with soot. Their blood was thick with toxins. This wasn't weather, it was warfare waged by industry against its own people. A statistician named Harold May, working for the Ministry of Health, began to compile daily death numbers. He charted the usual winter deaths, then overlaid the week of the smog. The line didn't just rise. It shot upward like a flare, thousands above the norm. Harold brought his findings to his superior, trembling. "These aren't natural," he said. "This is a mass casualty event." His report was quietly shelved. The Cabinet Office didn't want to alarm the public, not yet. They hoped the fog would pass, the deaths would slow, and the story would fade. But in hospitals from Whitechapel to Westminster, doctors knew better. The worst was still unfolding inside people's lungs. For days after the skies cleared, patients kept arriving. Some who had seemed fine during the fog now collapsed suddenly, their damaged lungs giving out. "It's like they've been poisoned," said one nurse. And in truth, they had. A young pathologist named Dr. Sheila Cavers conducted autopsies on several victims. What she found was horrifying: thick layers of black soot coating the bronchi, inflammation so severe the airways had closed. She wrote in her notes, "This is not disease. This is exposure." Her findings reached the desk of a rising scientist, Dr. Hugh A. M. Davies, a specialist in air pollution. He had warned years earlier that London's reliance on soft coal could lead to catastrophe. No one had listened. Now his phone rang constantly, from journalists, from doctors, from frightened city councillors. "They're dying from the air, Hugh," one physician told him. "Tell them why." Davies began gathering data: sulfur dioxide levels, visibility records, hospital admissions. What he found was beyond belief. In just a few days, air pollution had reached concentrations 40 times higher than normal. Enough to turn the city into a slow gas chamber. Meanwhile, in Parliament, the government faced a quiet reckoning. The public wanted answers. Reporters demanded numbers. But the officials hesitated, because the truth carried consequences. To admit fault would mean admitting decades of negligence. And worse, it would force them to confront the cost of Britain's post-war industry, an empire rebuilt on smoke. When the first unofficial estimate leaked, 4,000 dead, the public gasped. But Dr. Davies believed that number was far too low. His team continued counting hospital records, death certificates, coroner reports. The real number, they whispered, could be closer to 12,000. Still, no government statement came. Just vague condolences, talk of atmospheric disturbance, and advice to keep burning dry, clean fuels. But there was no such thing in post-war London. Families burned what they could afford: cheap, sulfur-laden coal from local yards. Even the hospitals used it. The poor had paid for warmth with their lives. In the weeks that followed, the city returned to motion. Buses rolled again. The fog lamps were scrubbed clean. But something in the air had changed, not the chemistry, but the feeling. People began to look up at the smoke curling from their chimneys and wonder, was it killing them? In back rooms and laboratories, scientists pressed on. They traced the weather inversion, modeled the airflow, calculated the lethal dose of sulfur particles. Their findings left no room for doubt: the Great Smog was not an act of nature. It was a consequence, a byproduct of unchecked industry, poverty, and political blindness. By January, Parliament could no longer pretend. Funeral statistics had doubled. Insurance claims soared. The Ministry of Health faced internal revolt from doctors demanding reform. "If we do not act," wrote Dr. Davies in his final report, "it will happen again. And next time, it may not stop at 12,000. The file landed on the Prime Minister's desk in February 1953. He read it in silence. Then he turned to his advisor and said only, "Draft me a plan. No more smoke in the streets." It would take years for that promise to take shape, but the law was already being written in the dust of London's dead. By spring of 1953, the grief had hardened into memory, but not silence. Families were still burying loved ones lost to what officials delicately called the incident. Doctors refused to move on. Scientists published papers, one after another, proving beyond question that the Great Smog had not been an accident of weather, but a man-made mass poisoning. The pressure mounted. In Parliament, members from both sides began demanding answers. A quiet investigation turned official. Witnesses were called, and the hearings became somber affairs, not angry, but mournful. Nurses described patients suffocating in their arms. Mothers spoke of children who went to sleep and never woke. One undertaker testified that he had run out of coffins by the third day. The committee room fell silent. No one asked him to repeat it. The inquiry revealed a chain of failures. Britain's post-war economy, desperate for cheap energy, had flooded the market with low-grade coal, soft, sulfur-heavy, unfiltered. Poor families burned it by the sack. Factories dumped smoke into skies without filters, without oversight. And for years, scientists had warned that under the right weather, still, cold, windless, London could turn into a sealed chamber of death. Those warnings had been ignored. When the report was published, its title was clinical, Air Pollution, the Great London Smog of 1952. But its words carried sorrow. It described how the smoke trapped beneath a temperature inversion had turned toxic, reacting with fog to form sulfuric acid in the air. How the fine soot had lodged deep in lungs. How even those far from factories, the old, the frail, the newborn, had been claimed by a disaster they could neither see coming nor escape. The conclusion was simple: the air itself needed protection. It was a radical idea. For centuries, pollution had been a price of progress. Smoke meant industry. Industry meant power. But now, that same smoke had turned on its masters. The Great Smog had made it impossible to pretend that air was infinite, or harmless, or free. The campaign for change grew louder. Environmentalists didn't yet exist by name, but public health advocates and local councillors began calling for smokeless zones. Newspapers ran editorials demanding cleaner fuels. "We regulate our food and our water," one columnist wrote. "Must we not also regulate the air we breathe?" In 1954, a new draft bill began circulating, the Clean Air Bill. It proposed something revolutionary, that cities should restrict what fuels could be burned, relocate power stations away from dense populations, and convert homes to smokeless fuels. Industry pushed back, warning of costs, of job losses, of economic slowdown. But the memory of 1952 lingered like a ghost. Too many Londoners had seen what the sky could become. Finally, in 1956, the Clean Air Act passed into law. It was modest by modern standards, just a beginning, but it marked the first time in British history that air was recognized as something worth protecting. Cities began phasing out soft coal. Chimneys were redesigned. Smokeless zones appeared across London. Slowly, the skies began to clear. And yet, the law came too late for those already buried. In the years that followed, scientists kept revising the toll. 4,000, 8,000, 12,000. Some estimates climbed higher still, counting delayed deaths from lung disease and heart failure. The fog had lifted, but its shadow stretched for decades. In old photographs, London before 1952 looks almost unrecognizable, streets blurred by haze, monuments half hidden, a city forever under a dirty sky. The Great Smog changed that. It stripped the romance from the word fog. It showed the world what air could do when corrupted by neglect. From that winter forward, London would chase clarity, clear air, clear skies, clear conscience. The event rippled outward, inspiring similar legislation across Europe, then the United States, and later the world. Every emission limit, every smokeless zone, every Clean Air Act that followed bore its faint signature. The week the air turned black became the moment the world learned what breath was worth. And so, from the ashes of soot and silence, a single truth emerged, written not in ink, but in lungs: clean air isn't a gift. It's a law written in blood. The fight for a safer world is written in stories like this one. Subscribe to Laws Written in Blood for more documentaries on the moments that changed everything, and the people history should never forget.